good few weeks ago now, Nigel Farage went public with these accusations that the bank that he was banking with, both for his personal account and his business account, had called him out of the blue and said that they were going to close him down. As a consequence of this, he was also goes to try and open accounts elsewhere, gets turned away by, I think the running total at the moment is 10 other banks. He set forward a kind of series of reasons as to why he thought this had happened, that this was potentially politically motivated. Also, these politically exposed persons regulations, which seem to be incredibly onerous, combined with the fact that various people, particularly in Parliament, had been saying some very defamatory things about it, which he thought maybe kind of combined. And what was interesting was that immediately the response from the BBC, from The Guardian, from lots of people on Twitter was like, oh, he's obviously making this up, even though it seemed really plausible what he was accusing. The thing that's changed this week is that a dossier has been compiled, has been retrieved. Farage has done a subject access request, as they're called, about all the information that they had on him. And what's abundantly clear now is that a lot of deliberation, a lot of research and meeting did take place at his bank, Coutts, where, and it's laid out in black and white in this dossier, they said he wasn't aligned with the values of Coutts. I don't know what the values of Coutts are, maybe we can get into that. Essentially recycling all of the worst and probably most extreme criticisms one could level at Nigel Farage, that he's a trade in xenophobia and hate and so on, even dredging up accusations from his youth, or really kind of scraping the barrels up. And it's just laid out in black and white what seemed quite plausible to begin with. The fact that there has obviously been an element of political discrimination that's been creeping in, even with banks, even with this most basic of services that people should enjoy. And yet there's still, Laura, this temptation on the part of people, particularly on the centre-left, I suppose, or the left, to just say, oh, this is still a non-story.
Well, I think it's a huge story. I think it's deeply disturbing. I think that there's a theme that runs through all of your stories tonight, actually, which is polarisation, increasing tribalism, us and them. And it's actually something that we should all constantly be striving to watch out for, not just from a kind of peace hippie perspective that we should all be getting along and advancing understanding, but it's just ultimately not good for society. I thought that some of the attitudes to Nigel Farage were really disgusting, actually. I was talking to somebody at a party the other week and they said, oh, well, we don't care if Nigel Farage has lost his bank account, do we? And I thought, well, hang on a minute. I think we do. I think we care if anybody's lost their bank account. And of course, it wasn't just Nigel Farage. He's blown this whole story into prominence, but this has been it's been a campaign of the Free Speech Union for a while, because other people have been debanked through PayPal as well as bank accounts. Us for Them are a campaign group for children which are raised out of lockdown. They're totally non-partisan, and they were debanked on PayPal. The Free Speech Union was. This is about institutions basically being captured by kind of a woke ideology. And if you as the customer don't conform to these unspoken woke shibboleths, you could just be cut off at the knees. So the lack of transparency around it is really alarming. I mean, honestly, if it's Nigel Farage this month, it could be me in 6 months, for goodness knows what for perhaps being a climate denier. Now, I'm not a climate denier, don't quote me on this, but it's the same kind of thing, isn't it? You see, you've got the good people who follow all of these shibboleths and adhere to the dogma and do as they're told. They're the good people. And then the bad people who ask questions are the ones who get cut out of groups and societies. And that's what's happened to Nigel Farage. He hasn't been a good adherent to what feels like a religious dogma. So if you ask questions, it makes you bad.
Mm-hmm. No, completely. And it's interesting the quite flimsy responses that we're seeing to this. So one people will say, well, you see people on the left saying, well, this bank can do business with whoever it wants. It's got a strange defence of a, huge corporate autonomy there from some quite surprising people. You hear that trotted out. You hear people say, oh, this is no different from, people just deciding who they're just going to do business with. What do you make with those kinds of arguments? I mean, it's odd where they're coming from in many respects, but also surely there are certain things which we just need as a baseline to be able to function in society, and surely we shouldn't let partisanship slip into it.
Yeah, I remember the journalist Paul Mason appearing on Politics Live after the first story broke and speaking with absolute confidence that this was just banks following regulation and that there was nothing to see here and that it was all part of their adherence to the normal rules that were designed to defend us from money laundering. And if you know anything about Coutts, you would have been able to tell that was probably quite unlikely, because Coutts is known as a high net worth bank, which I don't think I'm defaming anyone here by saying it will adopt a degree of flexibility with its customers in order to keep their custom. That's part of their selling point. And they're also, it's been widely reported now that they're also the banking organisation for some quite questionable people. They've been accused of laundering money for the Italian mafia. There is a list of very questionable people on their client list. And I think you're right that it is remarkable that more people haven't come out and pointed out what an outrage this is. Because, if this was a journalist on the left who had their account cancelled, their face would be on banners, there'd be demonstrations, there'd be murals everywhere, give him his account back. It would be, the story would be far better suited to them if this was someone on the left, because they'd be able to say, this is capitalism trying to crack down on dissenters and all the rest of it. It's because it's someone on the right that it doesn't quite fit that story. There's some really strange details about this as well. I've been following Andrew Neil's reporting of this, and he tweeted today about a possible dinner meeting between a senior person at the BBC who was responsible for this story and one of the senior people at Coutts who was responsible for the decision. This looks like collusion in order to put forward a particular story.
That might move on by the time this comes out as well, because there's been some sort of indication that some apology might be in the offing. Because I think it was Simon Jack from the BBC who was the one who just quite credulously and uncritically reported Coutts' original denial, which was to say this was about him not having enough money in his account, essentially, which this dossier actually explicitly pushes back on. Upends. And then also, as you were saying, it was I think the individual in question is head of the NatWest group, but was sat next to him at a dinner the night before. And it's just that lack of, if nothing else, I'm not expecting Simon Jack at the BBC or particular journalists to, rush to the barricades, but they should at least show a degree of curiosity and scepticism of the line that is just being delivered to them.
Well, talk about how the left is saying, it's just banks doing business. They're private businesses. They can operate on any terms they want. This is exactly what it's not. Because if this was straightforward business with rules that can be broken, they would be transparently published and Nigel Farage would have known what he'd done in advance of doing it. But it's not true. This is actually about people who don't like other people. So they may be completely happy with somebody who is more politically aligned to them but breaks rules in another area. This is because he's a Brexiteer and Coutts, the staff, are coming out as being very staunch Remainers. This is all about not liking people and wanting to punish them. So it's the absolute opposite of doing business. Finally, on banks doing business, I'd say that actually they should be legally be obliged to give people bank accounts. I think, in today's world, you can't go around trading in magic beans and bartering. Everybody needs a bank account in order to function in modern society, and banks should not be allowed to end people's bank accounts. Maybe there should be a state bank for the people who can't get the private bank's business, but you shouldn't be able to take away someone's bank account. Otherwise, it's the modern form of exile or banishment. It's another way of casting them out. Yes,
it's unpersoning, definitely. I mean, I think that really summed it up. And Luke, what do you make, just in closing on this particular issue, of this idea that banks have values as well? There's one thing I'm quite curious, because you saw this in the dossier. It says it doesn't align with our values. It also has this fascinating passage about how we essentially need to exclude him in the pursuit of inclusivity. Many people have been sharing images of the front of Coutts' main headquarters in London, which of course has been dressed up in the Progress Pride flag. Does this story show that these banks actually believe their own kind of BS, that they actually kind of hold to these kinds of things? Because surely they must have known there was going to be some sort of backlash to this, and yet they still seem to have dug in. They still seem to have stuck to their story pretty firmly. I mean, is this an indication that this kind of woke capitalism thing is a bit more sincere than some people might not want?
I think wokeism and the kind of the woke ideology is a very easy way for big banks to wash what they're doing. I just encourage people. I mean, you see more and more of these woke adverts for banks nowadays. HSBC, I remember, has, especially during Pride Month, all banks, it seems obligatory to plaster its stuff with logos and things like that. But every time you see that, just go and look up some of the things that these banks are actually doing in the world. Raising a pride flag whilst assisting the royal family of Saudi Arabia, a place where homophobia is kind of absolutely rife. Think about actually what these banks are doing on the ground. Coutts is just one of them, It's a very easy way for them to distract from some of the things that they actually do. And I think when they talk about their values, at best it's contradictory, at worst it's completely intellectually dishonest.
Also, businesses can't have values. I'm really fed up with them saying they can. Now, a bank is it's a building, it's a collection of servers, it's a place that you store your money, you pay, and you get interest rates, and they look after it securely. That's all it is. People have values. The people who work there didn't like Nigel Farage. Banks can't have values.